The thundering sound of a backhoe tore through the morning peace in Lake Pine Valley, a quiet suburb of Portland, Oregon. Edward Thompson, a 68-year-old retired marine biologist, watched in horror through his window as trucks dumped tons of sand around his precious lake. His hands trembled as he clutched an already cold cup of coffee, while Catherine Adams, the HOA's new recreational activities coordinator, oversaw the transformation of her natural sanctuary into an artificial beach with a triumphant smile on her face. "That's completely illegal!" Edward shouted, crossing his meticulously tended garden. His gray hair fluttered in the cold October wind as he approached the fence that bordered his property. "This lake is private. It's been registered in my name for over 3 decades. Catherine, a middle-aged woman with artificially platinum blonde hair and sunglasses too expensive for a cloudy day, just nodded dismissively. "The rules have changed, Mr. Thompson. The assembly voted last week. This is now a community appeal." "What assembly? I wasn't notified of any vote," Edward protested, his face turning red with anger and frustration. "Oh, we sent an email to all the residents," Catherine replied with a condescending smile. "It's not our fault if you don't check your spam box." The lake in question wasn't just a decorative water source. During his years as a researcher, Edward had transformed it into a perfectly balanced ecosystem, home to rare species of freshwater fish from the Pacific Northwest region. It was his legacy, a conservation project that had begun with his late wife, Margaret, a botanist who shared his passion for environmental preservation. Edward watched helplessly as workers installed colorful parasols and prefabricated kiosks. A sound system was being set up, with speakers strategically placed to create the perfect beach atmosphere, in Catherine's words. "These changes will destroy the whole ecosystem," Edward tried to argue. "I have endangered species here. The Pacific lamprey, for example, only exists in a few places in the world." "Frankly, Mr. Thompson," Catherine rolled her eyes, "nobody cares about your primitive eels. People want entertainment. They want a place to relax at weekends, and we'll make good money from the tickets." The mention of tickets made Edward choke. "Tickets? You intend to charge to use my property?" "Community property," Catherine corrected. "And yes, we need to cover operating costs. $15 per adult, 10 per child. Residents will get a 20% discount, of course." Edward retreated into the house, his legs wobbly. In his office, surrounded by decades of documented research, photographs from scientific expeditions and, above all, meticulous records on each species that inhabited his lake, he began frantically searching for his ownership documents. While rummaging through his drawers, he found an old photo. He and Margaret, much younger, smiling next to their newly acquired lake. It was 1985 when they decided to turn that property into their life project. Margaret had passed away 5 years earlier, but their work together lived on in every inch of that ecosystem. The phone rang, interrupting their memories. It was his daughter, Madison, an environmental lawyer in Seattle. "Dad, I just saw the photos that neighbor Rebecca posted in the neighborhood group. What's going on?" "Maddie, they're destroying everything," his voice faltered. "The HOA has decided they can just take over the lake. They're turning it into a lying beach." "They can't do that," Madison replied firmly. "I'm sure there are several legal violations here. I'm taking the first flight to Portland." While she talked to her daughter, Edward looked out of the office window. A group of teenagers had already gathered around the lake, some even testing the temperature of the water with their feet. Catherine was supervising the installation of a sign, "Lake Pine Beach Club, your piece of paradise." "Dad, don't do anything drastic until I get there," Madison urged, noticing her father's prolonged silence. "I'll bring in some colleagues who specialize in environmental law. We can sort this out legally." "How long until you arrive?" 3 hours tops. Please don't confront Catherine anymore. She's clearly waiting for an explosive reaction from you to use against you." Edward hung up the phone and went back to the window. The sound of pop music now echoed through the air, scaring away the birds that used to frequent his garden. A truck arrived bringing colorful plastic sun loungers. In his observation tank, set up in a corner of the office, a young Pacific lamprey swam lazily. It was part of a behavioral study that Edward had been conducting for months. Watching the fish, Edward felt a determination grow inside him. It wasn't just his property that was at stake. It was a scientific heritage site, a biodiversity sanctuary, and the last tangible connection to his life's work alongside Margaret. Catherine Adams may have had the HOA on her side, but Edward Thompson had decades of scientific documentation, clear property rights, and, most importantly, a daughter who was a lawyer specializing in environmental law. The battle for Thompson Lake was just beginning. Madison Thompson arrived at Portland Airport at 2 in the afternoon, carrying only a small suitcase with documents and her laptop. During the flight, she had made dozens of calls and reviewed all the environmental legislation pertaining to the case. As she crossed the terminal lobby, she found her father waiting, visibly dejected. "Things have taken a turn for the worse," Edward said, as they walked to the parking lot. "Catherine got an emergency license from the prefecture for commercial operation. Apparently she has connections in the zoning department." On the way to Lake Pine Valley, Madison observed the changes in her childhood neighborhood. New condominiums had sprung up where once there were green areas, and billboards advertised future commercial developments. Gentrification was turning the once quiet suburb into a tourist destination. When they got home, the scene was even worse than the photos suggested. Dozens of people crowded the beach. Loud music echoed through the speakers, and street vendors offered drinks and snacks from makeshift carts. The lake, once crystal clear, had a worrying turbidity. "I need to take samples of the water immediately," Edward said, heading for his home laboratory. "The pH levels were altered this morning, and now with all these chemicals." Madison nodded, but her attention was focused on Catherine Adams, who walked among the visitors like a queen in her domain. "I'll talk to her first," she decided, adjusting her professional blazer. "Catherine Adams?" Madison approached, holding out a business card. "Madison Thompson, of Thompson & Associates Environmental Law. I'd like to discuss some serious violations I've observed here." Catherine examined the card with disdain. "Ah, the mad scientist's daughter. Honey, everything here is perfectly legal. We have all the necessary permits." "Including the environmental impact assessment required by the EPA for changes to endangered species habitats?" Madison asked, maintaining a professional tone. "Or the Oregon Department of Natural Resources permit for modification of a private body of water?" Catherine's smile faltered momentarily. "That's HOA property now. The vote was unanimous." "Interesting." Madison pulled a document from her briefcase. "Because according to county records, the title deed is still in my father's name, and I couldn't find any legal record of a transfer." At that moment, Edward emerged from his lab with an alarmed expression. "The chlorine levels are critical. It'll kill all the fish." Madison noticed some visitors stopping to listen to the discussion. "Catherine, I suggest you suspend operations immediately. Otherwise, in addition to the environmental violations, you will be personally liable for damage to private property and possible criminal negligence." "That's ridiculous," Catherine huffed, but her confidence was beginning to waver. "The community needs this recreational space. I'm not going to let some eccentric old man and his lawyer daughter ruin my project." "Your project?" Madison arched an eyebrow. "The HOA's financial records are public, Catherine. Exactly how much of that ticket revenue is going into the association's coffers?" Catherine's face paled. Before she could answer, a high-pitched scream cut through the air. A child had found a dead Pacific lamprey near the shore, its skin covered in a whitish substance, the effect of excessive chlorine. "Oh my God, what a disgusting thing!" a mother exclaimed, pulling her child away. "Is that one of the endangered species?" another visitor asked, starting to collect his things. "I don't want to get in trouble with federal law." Madison seized the moment. "Ms. Adams, I'm filing an injunction today. Until then, I suggest you shut down voluntarily, or the legal consequences will be even more severe." Catherine looked around, noticing that several visitors were already starting to leave. Her sand empire was literally slipping through her fingers. "This isn't over," she hissed, before turning away to try and contain the damage. Over the next few hours, Madison and Edward worked tirelessly. While she prepared the legal documentation and made calls to contacts at the EPA and the Department of Natural Resources, Edward collected samples and documented all the damage to the ecosystem. "We need an injunction today," Madison muttered, typing furiously on her laptop. "Every minute counts for the species that can still be saved." Edward watched the lake through his office window, remembering all the years of research and dedication. "Your mother would be proud of you, Maddie," he said softly. "She always said that you inherited the best of both of us, my stubbornness and her sense of justice." Madison smiled, but didn't take her eyes off the screen. "I found something interesting in the HOA records. Apparently, Catherine didn't follow the correct procedure for voting. Also, there are some suspicious financial transactions over the past few months." "What does that mean?" "It means that we're going to turn this battle over the lake into a full-blown investigation into the management of the HOA. Madison finally looked at her father. Catherine Adams picked the wrong property to try her scam on. As the sun set over Lake Pine Valley, the last visitors left the makeshift beach. Edward and Madison watched from the balcony, planning their next moves. The battle was just beginning, but for the first time since the nightmare began, Edward felt hope. In the observation tank, a young Pacific lamprey continued to swim, oblivious to the drama unfolding around its habitat. For Edward, that fish represented everything he was fighting for. Not just his property, but a legacy of conservation and respect for nature that he and Margaret had built together. An insistent knock on the door woke Madison at 5 a.m. When she opened it, she found Rebecca Martinez, the neighbor who had posted the initial photos of the incident, shivering despite the thick robe she was wearing. "Sorry about the hour," Rebecca whispered, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "But there's something you need to know about Catherine and the HOA." Madison led Rebecca into the kitchen, where Edward was already preparing coffee, unable to sleep due to worry about his lake. Rebecca took a USB stick out of her bag and placed it on the table. "I work as a freelance accountant," she explained. "Catherine hired me 3 months ago to organize the HOA's accounts. At first it seemed normal, but I started to notice discrepancies." Madison plugged the flash drive into her laptop while Rebecca continued. "I found out that Catherine set up a shell company, Pine Valley Recreation LLC. The HOA is outsourcing the management of the beach to this company, which is owned by her 19-year-old nephew." Edward frowned. "So the income from the tickets goes straight into her personal account," Rebecca confirmed. "But there's more. The emergency leave she got. It cost a donation of $50,000 to Councilman Phillips' re-election campaign." Madison typed furiously, documenting each revelation. "Rebecca, would you be willing to testify?" An engine noise interrupted the conversation. Through the window, they saw trucks arriving at the lake. "More sand?" Edward asked, incredulous. "No," Rebecca paled. "They're construction crews. Catherine plans to build permanent changing rooms and a restaurant. The foundations start today." Madison immediately picked up the phone, but Edward was already running outside, still in his pajamas. At the lake, Catherine was supervising the arrival of the workers, wearing a reflective vest over gym clothes. "You can't do this," Edward shouted. "You don't have a permit for permanent construction." "Actually, I do." Catherine smiled, brandishing a document. "Approved last night in an extraordinary session of the town council." Madison arrived at this point, still on the phone. "Stop everything immediately. I have a court injunction prohibiting any further alterations to the property." "What injunction?" Catherine scoffed. "I haven't received anything official." "Because it was issued 10 minutes ago by Judge Martinez," Madison replied, showing the email on her cell phone. "And yes, he's Rebecca's cousin." Apparently, tax fraud and bribery of public officials are sufficient grounds for emergency action. Catherine's smile faltered. More residents began to gather, attracted by the commotion. Among them was Gerald Phillips, the counselor, who looked extremely uncomfortable. "Gerald," Catherine called out. "You assured me this was settled." The counselor took a few steps back. "I'm sorry, Catherine, I can't get involved in anything else. The local press is investigating campaign donations." "Traitors, all of you!" Catherine shouted, her face red with anger. This was going to turn our dull neighborhood into a tourist destination. It was going to bring development. It was going to destroy a unique ecosystem, Edward corrected, and apparently line your pockets in the process. Just then, police cars arrived, followed by a car from the Department of Environmental Protection. Catherine tried to escape, but was stopped by two officers. "Catherine Adams," one of them announced, "is under arrest for fraud, embezzlement, and environmental violations." While Catherine was taken away, protesting loudly, Madison organized the removal of the construction equipment. Edward, with the help of environmental technicians, was already beginning to assess the damage to the ecosystem. "It will take months to restore everything," he sighed, looking at the devastated shores of his precious lake. "But we'll manage, Dad," Madison assured him. "And this time, we're going to secure additional legal protections. I'm thinking of turning it into a private natural heritage reserve." Rebecca approached, still trembling slightly. "I'm sorry I didn't speak up sooner. I was afraid of losing other HOA clients." "You did the right thing at the right time," Madison assured her. "Without your evidence, we wouldn't have gotten the injunction so quickly." Throughout the day, residents volunteered to help with the initial cleanup. The sand was removed, the kiosks dismantled, and the sound system uninstalled. Edward supervised everything, ensuring that no further damage was caused during the process. In the late afternoon, as the sun set over the partially restored lake, Edward found something that brought tears to his eyes. A young Pacific lamprey swimming close to the shore. Survivor. "Look, Maddie," he called to his daughter. "There's still hope." Madison smiled, watching the fish. "There always is, Dad. There always is." The battle for Thompson Lake had been won, but the work had only just begun. Restoring the ecosystem would be a long process, but now the whole community was involved. Edward and Margaret Thompson's legacy would not only survive, but grow stronger through this ordeal. On the horizon, dark clouds loomed, promising the first rain in weeks. It was as if nature itself was ready to help clean up, washing away the last vestiges of Catherine's makeshift beach and returning the lake to its original purity. The morning after Catherine's arrest, an emergency HOA meeting was called at the Lake Pine Valley Community Center. The room was packed, with residents eager to understand the extent of the scandal that had unfolded in their quiet neighborhood. Madison, armed with a detailed presentation on her laptop, methodically laid out every aspect of the fraud perpetrated by Catherine Adams. Projections on the screen showed graphs of suspicious transactions, compromising emails and photos documenting the environmental damage to the lake. In just 3 months, Madison explained, Catherine embezzled over $200,000 through Pine Valley Recreation LLC. The money from the tickets never reached the association's coffers. Murmurs of indignation filled the room. An elderly woman raised her hand tremulously. "What about our monthly fees? They went up 30% this year for community improvements." "Excellent question, Mrs. Wilson," Madison replied, switching to the next slide. "We discovered that Catherine created several shell companies that supposedly provided services to the HOA. In reality, they were just conduits for embezzling the residents' money." In the back of the room, Edward was talking quietly with Dr. Harriet Chen, an aquatic ecology expert from the University of Oregon. She had just completed a preliminary assessment of the damage to the lake. "The good news," Dr. Chen whispered, "is that some of the most resilient species survived. The bad news is that the estimated cost of completely restoring the ecosystem is in the region of $500,000. The meeting was interrupted by a commotion in the hall. Gerald Phillips, the counselor involved in the scandal, entered accompanied by his lawyer. The buzz in the room increased instantly. "I have an announcement to make," Phillips declared, his voice trembling slightly. "In exchange for immunity from prosecution, I have agreed to cooperate fully with the investigations." Catherine Adams did not act alone. Madison exchanged meaningful glances with Rebecca, who had already foreseen this possibility. "Go ahead, Councilman," Madison encouraged, while discreetly activating the recorder on her cell phone. The plan was much bigger than just a beach, Phillips revealed. Catherine had negotiated with developers to turn the entire area around the lake into a resort. Mr. Thompson's lake was just the first phase. The revelation caused an uproar in the room. Several residents began shouting at the same time, some demanding the immediate resignation of the entire HOA board. "Quiet, please," Madison raised her voice. "There is one more crucial issue to be discussed: the costs of environmental restoration." Dr. Chen presented his technical report, detailing every aspect of the damage done to the ecosystem. Photos of dead fish and analysis of the contaminated water provoked expressions of horror from those present. "Does the HOA have insurance to cover this?" someone asked. "Unfortunately not," Madison replied. "Catherine has canceled several insurance policies in recent months, probably to divert those funds as well." Edward stood up, his imposing figure attracting everyone's attention. "I'm not interested in retaliation or revenge," he declared. "My only concern is to restore the natural habitat that has been destroyed. These species can't wait for endless legal battles." Rebecca, who had remained quiet until then, raised her hand. "I have a suggestion. What if we turned this tragedy into an opportunity?" All eyes turned to her as she continued. "Mr. Thompson has spent decades studying and preserving that ecosystem. What if, instead of just restoring it, we created an educational center, a place where schools could bring students to learn about environmental conservation?" The suggestion provoked murmurs of approval. Madison quickly realized the potential of the idea. "We could seek partnerships with universities, create research programs. And that would help us get federal funding," Dr. Chen added enthusiastically. "There are several incentive programs for environmental education initiatives." Edward felt a lump in his throat. It was exactly the kind of project Margaret would have loved. His wife always talked about turning the lake into a learning center for future generations. The meeting continued for another 2 hours, with specific committees being formed to deal with different aspects of the crisis. One group would be responsible for tracking down the embezzled funds, another for the legal side, and a third for the educational center project. As everyone began to disperse, Gerald Phillips approached Edward. "Mr. Thompson, I know that an apology isn't enough." "No, it's not," Edward cut in dryly. "But your cooperation with the investigations is a start." Madison watched the interaction from afar, organizing her notes. Her phone vibrated with a message from the Seattle office. 3 more similar cases of abuse by HOAs had come to light after the Thompson case was reported in the media. "Dad," she called, "I think we've found our new specialty in the office, defending homeowners against abuse by HOAs." Edward smiled, for the first time in days. "Your mother always said that the worst situations can bring the best opportunities." As they left the community center, father and daughter stopped to look at the lake in the distance. The afternoon sun was reflecting on the water, which was gradually beginning to regain its natural clarity. A small group of volunteers were working on the banks, removing the last vestiges of the makeshift beach. "You know," Edward said thoughtfully, "maybe Rebecca is right. Maybe it's time to share this place with more people. The right way this time." Madison squeezed her father's arm affectionately. The legal battle wasn't over yet, but a new vision for the future was beginning to take shape, one that both honored the past and pointed to a more hopeful future. 6 months after Catherine Adams's arrest, Thompson Lake was unrecognizable, but this time for the positive transformation. What had once been a disastrous attempt to create an artificial beach was now becoming a model for environmental conservation and community education. Edward watched through the window of his newly opened research center as a group of high school students followed Dr. Chen in a practical lesson on aquatic ecosystems. The modest building, constructed with sustainable materials and solar energy, had been financed by a combination of private donations and federal funds for environmental education. "The oxygen levels are almost normal," Madison commented, reviewing the latest reports on her tablet. She had decided to open a satellite office of her firm in Portland, specializing in cases of abuse by HOAs. "And the fish populations are recovering faster than expected." "It's amazing how nature can heal itself when we give it a chance," Edward replied, adjusting his new badge as Director of Research at the Margaret Thompson Center for Aquatic Studies. The decision to name the center after his late wife had been unanimous among the locals. A photo of her, smiling beside the lake in its early days, occupied a prominent place in the entrance hall. The Thompson v. HOA case had become a national precedent. Madison was now receiving calls from all over the country, from homeowners facing similar situations. His experience was helping to shape new legislation to protect homeowners from abuses by neighborhood associations. "Mr. Thompson," an excited voice interrupted his thoughts. It was Kevin, one of the teenagers in the internship program. "We found 3 more Pacific lampreys today, and there are signs of breeding." Edward smiled, remembering the only surviving specimen that had given everyone hope on that fateful day. Now the population was growing again, a living symbol of nature's resilience. Rebecca Martinez, now treasurer of the new HOA board, entered the center carrying a stack of documents. "You won't believe what we found in the old records," she announced. "Catherine had plans to do this with 3 other lakes in the area. She was already negotiating with developers." "Well, she'll have plenty of time to rethink her business plans in federal prison," Madison commented. Catherine had been sentenced to 5 years for fraud and environmental crimes. Councilman Phillips, after cooperating with the investigations, had resigned and was doing community service, ironically, helping to restore the lake he had helped destroy. A new generation of scientists was being born thanks to the center's educational program. Students who had previously barely noticed the lake were now passionately defending its preservation. The project had even inspired other communities to protect their own natural resources. "Dad," Madison called out, noticing Edward's nostalgic expression. "You're thinking about her, aren't you?" Edward nodded. "Margaret always said that true progress lies not in mastering nature but in learning to live in harmony with it. I think we've finally understood what she meant." A roar of applause drew his attention. Outside, Dr. Chen was showing the students something through a portable microscope. The young faces lit up with admiration, reminding Edward of his own passion for science, rekindled by this new phase in his life. "You know what's most ironic?" Madison reflected. "Catherine wanted to turn this place into a tourist attraction. Well, she succeeded, just in a very different way than she had planned." It was true. The Margaret Thompson Center for Aquatic Studies had become a national model for conservation and environmental education. Groups from all over the country visited to learn about its unique approach to community involvement and preservation. The former beach had given way to a carefully designed observation area, with elevated walkways that allowed visitors to observe the ecosystem without disturbing it. Educational plaques, written by Edward, told the story of each species that inhabited the lake. "Sometimes you have to lose something to really understand its value," Edward philosophized, watching a group of birds returning to their restored habitat. This community almost lost an irreplaceable natural treasure, but in the process, it found something even more valuable, a common purpose. Madison hugged her father, both of them contemplating the legacy they had helped to build. Lake Thompson was no longer just a private estate. It had become a symbol of resistance, renewal, and hope. As the sun set over Lake Pine Valley, casting golden reflections on the now crystal-clear waters of the lake, Edward thought about how much his life had changed. What had started as a battle to protect his property had turned into something much bigger, a movement that united a community and inspired others to follow its example. In the center's observation aquarium, descendants of the sole surviving Pacific lamprey swam peacefully, oblivious to the impact their species had had on the transformation of an entire community. For Edward, they were a constant reminder that sometimes the greatest victories begin with the determination to save something small and precious. The future of Thompson Lake was now secure, protected not just by legal documents, but by the collective commitment of a community that had learned, the hard way, the true value of its natural heritage. And somewhere, Edward was sure, Margaret was smiling.